Good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started this morning. I trust everyone had a good night last night, and glad to see you all here this morning. Our first speaker this morning will be Mr. Stuart Poteau, and he is the Executive Director of the Virginia Conflict of Interest and Ethics Advisory Council since 2016. So at this time, please make him welcome, please.
Thank you very much. Everyone can hear me in the back? Yep, very good. All right, before I get started, I have two important business things of housekeeping. First, the presentation which I'm about to give is the mandatory ethics that's required every 2 years. So if someone listened to me or took the training, the ethics training last year or within 2 years, you do not have to sit through this. My feelings will not be hurt if you get up and discreetly leave to get another cup of coffee or some more bacon. And the second thing is, I believe this is the last day of the conference, and I am just guessing, I do not know, but this is a chance for many of you to see colleagues you have not seen for a year, and it's the last night, and there was some bourbon, and those cigars weren't going to smoke themselves, and you're thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, I cannot possibly deal at 8:30 in the morning with some dweeb droning on and on about ethics. I need to leave. Once again, my feelings will not be hurt. And you're like, but I need to get after 2 hours, I got to get it in. I got the ethics training in. We have on the Ethics Council website, and the information is on the back page, or contact information, we have the training that's required in the form of a module that you can go on and just watch it. So if you just cannot, you need to go take a little break, you can't handle me this morning, you can still get your mandatory training in by watching it online. And once again, my feelings will not be hurt. With that being said, let's go ahead, jump in, and get started. So, I am the Executive Director of the Conflict of Ethics Advisory Council. The training I'm giving, as I mentioned, is the mandatory one required every 2 years. We use this sort of handout, probably some of you have seen it before, that we go through when we present the training. Most of this is language that's just taken from the Code of Virginia, but I try to make it a little more interesting, if that is at all possible with such a dry topic. And I'll also give you some practical tips and notes that can help you in your role as sheriffs and possibly deputies as you are trying to make sure you don't run afoul of the Conflict of Interest Act. We call it COIA. You'll see on page 2 the council membership, and I want to point out that the council is in the legislative branch of government. The reason why that is important is because we do not have any enforcement power and we do not have any investigatory power. Third, we take confidentiality very, very strictly. The council's fairly new. It was created in 2016, and we were really designed to be a safe place. You can always come to us for advice and guidance. We will do our best to help you. I'm paid good money to analyze situations and give the best possible guidance that I can. We hope that you follow our guidance. If you do not, that is on you and not on us. I am not the one that goes to prison. You would be. But we really are safe. We take the confidentiality so seriously. In fact, we will neither confirm nor deny that anyone even came to us for guidance. It's sometimes amusing because we'll get questions from like boards of supervisors, and I'm keeping a straight face, but I'm getting the same question from 5 board members in a row, but I don't let any of them know that others have come to me with the same question because they have not given me permission to talk to them in a group. So we take it very seriously, and you can never, ever get in trouble coming to us. We're the ultimate safe harbor. You'll see on page 2 we have the statutory duties that are set out by the council. It's page 2 going to page 3. And the ones that are probably going to be most appropriate for all the things that the council does that's relevant for you in your role as sheriffs is number 1 and number 12. Number 1 I've kind of alluded to already. The council is empowered to furnish formal and informal guidance to all persons that are required to comply with the Conflict of Interest Acts, which of course includes all of you in this room. Informal guidance, we have an official policy of a turnaround time of 2 to 4 weeks. Actually, since I've become the director, I've really tried to shorten that down. I would say on average, we're probably more like 3 to 5 business days. During the month of January, February, or during a filing session in June, we may get a little bit backed up, but we will always try to get you an answer, if possible, within the time frame that you need. That being said, if you have a definite deadline coming up, like I really need to know an answer by next Wednesday or this coming Thursday, let us know what your deadline is. That helps us, and we will do our best to get you an answer within that time frame. That being said, please do not wait till the 11th hour. It hasn't happened yet, but I can envision someone saying, listen, I've got to have a meeting coming up in 2 hours, and I'm supposed to take a vote, and I don't know if I'm allowed to vote, and I cannot possibly analyze this in 2 hours. I'm sorry. When did you know about this? 2 months ago? Come on, guys, work with us. We're here to help you, help us help you. Our rule for how you can communicate with us for informal guidance is any way you want. Typically, it's phone calls and email. Occasionally, we get a little bit of postal mail. That's pretty rare. In theory, someone can stop by our offices. Glad to see you. Our rule is that we will initially reply to your communication with whatever form you communicated to us. So if you leave me a voicemail, I will call you back unless you explicitly say in your voicemail, please do not call me, send me an email, and vice versa. If you send me an email, I will email you back unless your email says, please call me at this number. One nice thing about coming to the council for guidance, I mentioned the safe harbor, and we actually have a specific safe harbor provision in the code. If you come to the council for guidance and you follow our guidance, you are immune from prosecution in any state court. However, there are 3 things that need to apply for this safe harbor provision to apply. So this is the first thing you may want to take a quick note on. Number 1 is your request for guidance has to be in writing, although email does count. That's a form of writing. Number 2, there has to be a full and good faith disclosure of all the relevant facts. You can't kind of cheat the system by saying, I'm thinking about having a contract with Acme. Can I do that? It's like, okay. Oops, I forgot to mention my wife owns the company. Now, that obviously will not work. But if you give a good faith disclosure of all the relevant facts, and you get a response from us in writing, once again, it's going to be email counts, you are completely immune from prosecution in any state court for following our guidance in good faith. That's the informal guidance process. That's 99.999% of all the guidance we give. People like that because we really try to make it timely and get you an answer in a hurry. You also have the ability to request a formal guidance opinion, a formal advisory opinion, an FAO. That one is not as useful in terms of day-to-day jobs and operation for one big reason, and that is by statute, we cannot tell you the results, the analysis, the conclusion until the actual ethics council meets and votes and approves the decision. These days, the council typically only meets about once a year, maybe twice a year. So if you put in a request in March, April, May, June, and we have a requirement of 60 days before a meeting, you won't get your answer until November or December. In other words, the formal advisory opinion is not designed for a quick turnaround time. What should I do? Can I accept this gift? What is the formal advisory opinion designed for? It's designed for sort of very, very broad questions. In many ways, they're akin to like attorney general opinions. Very broad questions are going to have applicability to many people on a general topic all around the Commonwealth. They're like, I think a lot of people are curious. Is this the kind of gift that's acceptable or not? The formal advisory opinions, the parallel with the AG opinions continues on. They are published. They're published on the council's website. However, maintaining the policy of confidentiality that the council takes very strictly, your name will be redacted, so we do not publish who it was that requested the opinion. And if necessary, we will also redact certain information from the opinion such that no one can sort of read between the lines and go, oh, I know who asked for this. So it is an option. It is available. Most people don't use it. We usually have a request of maybe one a year, one every 2 years. And it's going to be for something that's sort of broad that you think people throughout the Commonwealth would like to know the answer to. But in all likelihood, if you come to the council for guidance, it will be the informal guidance process. Turning the page, you'll see the other function that the council does that may be useful for many of you in this room. Number 12, we receive and review requests for approval of travel submitted by individuals required to file a statement of economic interest, blah, 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 blah. That basically just says, you file travel waiver requests with us and we will approve them. And I'll discuss that process and what that means a little bit later on in my presentation. So the Conflict of Interest Act, more properly the State and Local Government Conflict of Interests Act, COIA, really sort of has two parts to it if you were going to divide. One is things that are prohibited, you can't do it, and the other half is reporting requirements. Gifts falls exactly in the middle because some gifts you can accept, some you cannot accept, that would be illegal, and then some gifts you can accept that you'll be reporting, so gifts is right in the middle. The prohibited conduct comes first. You'll see on page 3 to the top of page 4, we have 2.2, 3101, and I say this all the time. This is a very important statute, but I don't spend a lot of time on it. I'm certainly not going to bore you all by reading all 10 provisions of the statute. But that's not to deny its importance. So please, sometime today, later this week, take just 2 minutes. Just quickly read through all 10 of the things that are prohibited conduct. It's important to know, but you also see why. It's not terribly complicated. If I was going to summarize 2.2, 3103 in just very simply, I would say what it really boils down to is don't take bribes. Bribes are bad. They're prohibited. A little bit more specific is if someone is giving you a gift or a business opportunity or a tip or employment or just anything, and it feels wrong, it just feels squirrely, this guy is just dripping oil, don't take the gift. Not only is that potentially a violation of 3103, but also you are in political positions, I think you all recognize, it will not be worth the hassle. Just avoid that. So that's 3103, and that's why also we don't get a lot of questions about 3103 prohibited conduct. It's like we sort of joke, if the very fact you're asking us probably means you already know the answer, which is, yeah, I should not be taking this gift, or I should not let this guy continually buy me lunch as we're negotiating a contract for my office. The only thing I will draw your attention to is number 4. You cannot use confidential information that you've required by reason of your public office that's not available to the public for your own benefit. I don't think that's really shocking or surprising. Does anyone here, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I couldn't call up my stockbroker and buy Acme stock? Yeah, if it's confidential information that you've learned, you can't use it for your own benefit. Also, please note, Virginia is strict on this point, you can't use it for anyone else's benefit. I can't imagine anyone would say, all right, I know I couldn't benefit myself, but I'll call my college roommate and tell him to buy the Acme stock. No, you can't do it. If it's confidential, it has to remain confidential. You cannot act on it for your own financial benefit until such time as the information becomes public. So what else is prohibited under COIA? Well, we have the whole concept of personal interests. And personal interests can be a little bit tricky, but I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible. You'll see on page 4, most of this starts off as just statutory definitions. What is a personal interest? That's what we have to start out with. And you'll see it's defined. A personal interest is a financial benefit or it's a liability that accrues to you or a member of your immediate family. Once again, this is a time to take out your pens, make a quick note here. What is immediate family? Virginia has a very, very limited but precise definition, and you always need to keep it in mind. Immediate family is your spouse, whether or not you are residing together. Occasionally we will get questions, I'm in the middle of a divorce. Is my spouse still immediate family for purposes of the act? Yes. Until the final divorce decree is signed, your spouse is your immediate family, always. That's one part of the definition. The other part is immediate family also includes anybody who both, two-part test, resides with you and whom you claim as a dependent for tax purposes. Usually this arises in the context of children that are between the ages of 15, 16, and 21, 22. They're old enough that they can have jobs. They're getting ready to leave the nest. They're getting ready to go off to college. Have they actually left the nest yet? We sometimes get questions about this, and I just dialogue with the person that's making the inquiry. What does the driver's license say? Do they still list your address as their residence, or have they listed somewhere else? And do you claim them as a dependent for tax purposes? If you do, that they're immediate family. And then remember, your spouse is always immediate family no matter what. Why do we care about immediate family? We care about immediate family because any personal interest that belongs to your spouse, I tend to use the word spouse in lieu of immediate family, and always it's the same. When I say spouse, please think immediate family. Any personal interest that belongs to your immediate family, your spouse, it's imputed to you. And also when we talk about gifts, Any gift that goes to your spouse gets imputed to you. If you think about it, it makes sense. People cannot just do an end run around the COYA statute by saying, oh, I know I can't give the sheriff this mink stall, I'll just give it to the spouse. No, it's going to be imputed to you as well, so that's why we care about immediate family. So personal family, it's the financial benefit or liability, and the statute then goes on to say that such interest shall exist by reason of, and there's 6 things, we've set them out, actual language from the code. But really, 95% of the time, we're looking at the first three that are listed. Ownership in a business, if the ownership interest exceeds 3%, so that's going to be the first trigger. You have ownership of a company and it's 3% or more, you have a personal interest in that company. And then 2 and 3, they're kind of, I think, the same. You can sort of smush them together. Annual income that exceeds, or salary, other compensation, fringe benefits, any other kind of benefit you get from the use of property, any combination thereof, that is or is anticipated to exceed $5,000 annually. So those are the 2 main ways you'll have a personal interest in a company, an organization, an entity, sole proprietorship that does business. I have an ownership stake in the business, 3% or more, or I'm getting $5,000 or more, or I can reasonably anticipate I'm going to get $5,000 or more from this company, this business, over the course of a year. Yes, that could include, for example, I loan someone money and they're paying me the money back. If it's going to be more than $5,000 in a year, yes, you have a personal interest in that company, that business. Okay, so that's the personal interest. Same thing applies for my spouse, my immediate family. It gets imputed to me as well. What do we do with this? Well, 2 things we have to always be aware of when we have personal interests, and they're 2 distinct things. Personal interest in contracts and personal interest in transactions. We'll do the contracts first. A personal interest in a contract is simply that I have a personal interest either directly, like I'm a party to a contract, or I have a personal interest in a business that's a party to a contract, and this contract is with my own agency. It's with my own sheriff's office. A very practical example. Technically, I work for the Division of Legislative Services. The Division of Legislative Services is thinking about going ahead and buying new computers to replace all the computers because they're old and they're not working well. My agency is thinking about getting Apple because they think Apple is going to work better than Dell computers. And my spouse, who I'm in the middle of a messy divorce with, and she lives in Washington State, but it doesn't matter. My spouse works for Apple Computer. Does anyone here start to see where we are getting into some, as I say, troubled waters? My agency is getting ready to do a fairly big contract, maybe over $100,000, going to a company that my wife works for. Do we see this? Yeah, that's a clear example. I have a personal interest in a contract. Now, that's not the end of the analysis. You're going to see that I've written on page 4, right from the code, the general rule is I cannot have a personal interest in a contract with my agency other than my own contract of employment. But then it goes on to say, there's many exceptions to this prohibition. It is recommended that if you ever find yourself in a situation where you think you have a personal interest in a contract with your own office, please contact the council. We can review it and let you know whether it's going to be acceptable or not acceptable. Believe it or not, most of the time it is acceptable. I'd say probably 90-95% of the time. And the reason why is you can have personal interests in contracts arising through no fault of your own, nothing you did. And we don't want to have a situation where people in Virginia, they start their job or they start their office, and then on the very first day of the office, you walk in and you're like, oh, so what are the computers we use in this office? Dell. In fact, we've got an outstanding contract with them. They do all our service stuff. Oh, my wife works for Dell. I guess I'm going to have to resign on my first day. No. One of the exceptions that's very, very useful, and I think it sort of explains what the whole purpose of COYA is, which is giving the public confidence in, the clean dealings of all officers and employees, is if you have a personal interest in the contract, but you did not negotiate the contract on behalf of your office and your immediate family or your spouse did not negotiate the contract on behalf of the private company, and you don't have an ownership interest in the company, that's acceptable. That is one of the exceptions. Like I said, that's kind of the analysis that we like to do. Sometimes we will recommend as a best practice that if there is an going contract, we may recommend please insert that or have whoever's doing the negotiations specifically put in. And it is to be noted that Stuart Petto played no part in negotiating the contract between DLS and Apple for this. So anyways, the one thing I want you to think about it is if you find yourself in a situation where your office's money is going into your pocket, but not directly through your paycheck or through the comp board, is going in a sort of a roundabout way. My office is going to hire Jake's lawn cutting to do all the yard work in front of my office, and my wife owns 50% of Jake's lawnscaping because Jake is her brother-in-law and she owns 50% of it. And that's a situation where my office's money is going into my pocket in a roundabout way, and that's where you need to be careful. Like I said, the analysis of these are very fact-specific. We're glad to review it with you confidentially. That's the situation you look out for. If you find yourself there, contact us. We're glad to help and let you know whether you can go forward with the contract, or you can't, or you can, but you need to do something to make sure everything is copacetic and you won't run into problems. So that's personal interest in contracts. What are personal interests in transactions? Well, the transaction you'll see on page 5, it's any matter that's considered by your office, whether in committee, subcommittee, an entity, a part thereof, or just you yourself, in which it's going to be an official action. Official action is being taken or contemplated. So, personal interest in the contract was we're getting ready to buy a whole bunch of Apple computers. The transaction is that's the official action that's going to be made on behalf of the agency. I mentioned that there's a lot of exceptions to having a personal interest in a contract. There kind of has to be, or people would be getting conflicted out of their positions all the time, or agencies would be having to void contracts all the time. Transactions are much, much more limited because if you think about it, this is something that you actually are doing in your official role. What's a good example of this, trying to make it practical? My boss is thinking about switching from Dell computers to Apple computers. My wife works for Apple. I have a personal interest. It should be okay on the contract side of things if I don't participate. But if I participate, does anyone start to see now why the public is going to, at the very least, say, how convenient? Stewart's agency was getting ready to buy $100,000 worth of Apple computers, and surprise, surprise, his wife works for Apple. My. And that is why the number of exceptions for participating in a transaction are much more limited. There are a few, but we will review them with you just to make sure it's okay. Most of the time, it is not. You can see on D, the rule is you must publicly disqualify yourself if the transaction applies only to the entity in which you have a personal interest, or you do have the personal interest, but you cannot meet one of the limited 3 exceptions. The transaction involves all part of it. So for example, let's say for buying the computers is a big purchase, my agency is going to put out an RFP. My boss comes to me and says, hey, Stuart, you know a lot about computers. Will you work on the RFP? That's the one where I sort of have to tell my boss, I can't do this. I'm conflicted out. I have a personal interest in this transaction. There's going to be no exception that applies. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, it would just be so easy for me if I'm doing just even the first draft of the RFP. I could be very clever and say, okay, whatever company we hire, the name should rhyme with Snapple. Surprise. So that's why the public says, listen, if you actually have that kind of a personal interest in the entity and it's involving only that entity, you cannot participate and you have to publicly disqualify yourself. You can also occasionally have collateral consequences for a personal transaction. Once again, be careful of those, and it's the same sort of a situation where my agency's money will be going to me indirectly. Here's an example that comes up. I don't know if it would apply to anyone in this room, but it illustrates the principle very well. You have someone who is working on behalf of a state agency for a very, very large construction contract. And the agency is going to be picking between 3 companies, A, B, and C. And the officer or the employee says, well, I don't have any personal interest in A or B or C. I don't get more than $5,000 from any of them. In fact, I get no money. No one in my immediate family does. I have no ownership interest in these 3 companies. So everything is hunky-dory, right? Probably, except, remember I mentioned earlier, you have to do the full good faith disclosure of all the relevant facts. It just so turns out that company B, when they get big contracts, they always have subcontractors. And Company B, exclusively for the last 10 years, for every contract they have had in Virginia, uses the Acme Pipe Fitting Company for that part of the subcontract. And this officer, he owns 50% of Acme. Do we suddenly see now why he's not exactly disinterested? He's going to have a very strong incentive to say, hey, I think A, B, and C are all really good, but I just like that Company B. I do think they do the best work. Yeah, because you know Company B is very likely to then give a subcontract. So once again, it's the whole situation. You find that your agency's money, your office's money is going to be going to you indirectly. This could be problematic. Please check with us. We will review the details with you and let you know whether you can proceed with that transaction or not. And the last thing I will point out is occasionally the council has gotten a little bit more strict on this in terms of a matter of interpretation. It was always the law, but they've really emphasized it. If you do a lot of volunteer services for an organization or a company, you're like, well, I don't have a personal interest. I volunteer my time, and I don't own it. It's a nonprofit, and there's no ownership. But if you do so much work, a lot of services for it, that could once again impute a personal interest in the transaction if that private nonprofit company is about to be getting once again your office's money and will benefit them. As we always say, the devil is in the details. We'll examine that very carefully with you and let you know whether you can proceed with the transaction or you cannot. Now, let's say you do have a personal interest in the transaction, but you've checked with your Commonwealth's attorney, you checked with your, perhaps, your local attorney, you checked with the AG, you checked with us, you came, and hopefully us because we're the best, okay? And we've said, yes, it's going to be okay. You can participate in this transaction. You're right. You do have a personal interest. You spotted that. Thank you for coming to us for guidance, but you can participate. There still needs to be the public disclosure of this fact so that the public is reassured that nothing was hidden. What this means is that if this transaction is going to be discussed at any kind of a public meeting, you do need to put it for every meeting. You need to put it in the minutes of it. Doesn't mean to be complicated, just a little quick boilerplate language. Mr. Chairman, as we move to item number 5 on the agenda, please let the record reflect I have a personal interest in this transaction. We're going to be discussing the Acme Corporation. I do have a personal interest in this company. However, I've checked and I am permitted to participate because I meet the B1 exception or the B3 exception. But there's always going to be that public disclosure. What if it's going to be an official transaction? I probably would not apply to anyone in this room, but just in case. It's an official transaction, but it's not going to be the subject of a meeting. In that case, you just do the same thing, but it will be a memo. You just type up the facts that I was involved with this transaction. I had the personal interest. Here's why I had the personal interest. I was able to participate. And then you file that in your office. The language is the clerk or other administrative head. That's a public document, and it's kept for 5 years. And the whole point, once again, is really so the public is reassured. No one played any games. Yes, it is true that there was a personal interest with some collateral, things that might benefit a company I have a personal interest in, but it was okay and I participated. On the flip side, let's say the answer is no, you just cannot participate. Once again, there has to be that public disclosure. The answer is not then, okay, I just sort of sit quiet during the board meeting, or, if it was a transaction and you had the personal interest in it, you'll do the public disclosure, and it's going to be the exact reverse. It'll be like, Mr. Chairman, as we move to item 5 on the agenda, please let the record reflect I have a personal interest in this matter because I have an ownership interest in the Acme company, so I will not be participating on item 5 of the agenda, and you're putting that on the public record. People sometimes ask if it's in the context of a meeting, do you have to leave the room? No, you do not. At that point, once you've disqualified yourself and given the public notice, your right to remain in the room is exactly the same as any member of the general public. So yeah, if the meeting goes into a closed session, you would have to leave the room. But otherwise, you can just continue to sit up there on the dais, but you cannot participate. So, no winking, don't pass a note to the chair, vote yes on this. Just sort of, you sit there. Some people find that uncomfortable. So they're like, listen, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to go out in the hallway and please call me when we move on to the next item. But you do not, once you've given your public notice, you do not have to leave the room if you do not choose to do so. Once again, I'm going to repeat this, but I really want to stress this. This can be tricky. It is complicated. I've tried to simplify it, but this is probably some of the more intricate ones that we analyze in our office. If you have any questions, please come to us. Our contact information is on the back, and we're glad to assist you with that. That was all horribly dry. I'm actually amazed that everyone has not left the room at this point and said, okay, I'll just watch the video online. We're going to get to something that's a little bit more interesting now, and that's the subject of gifts. What are gifts? Gifts is something that's given to you for free or at discount. It's fun. I love gifts. Everyone loves gifts. I love the holidays. But sometimes gifts can get us in trouble. So when it comes to gifts, we have sort of three things we first need to pay attention to in terms of facts. Number one, who is giving you the gift? That makes all the difference in the world. My grandmother gives me a large diamond brooch that I can pass on to my wife. It's a family heirloom. The story is that her great-great-grandfather was playing poker with George Washington and won it, and this is a cherished family heirloom, and she's giving it to me. This is fantastic. This is heartwarming. You know, it's a little bit of history being passed on through the ages. That's perfectly appropriate. Mr. Oily Salesman who wants to get a contractor at your office offers you the diamond brooch. Suddenly, this is not a heartwarming story anymore. This is a headline, and it's bad. So we really always need to pay attention to who is giving you the gift. That is the number one key question. Believe it or not, usually it's in the context of the General Assembly. We get staffers that say, oh, Senator so-and-so got a gift. Like, who gave the gift? And the staff, I don't know. It's like, well, I don't know either. I really can't help you with this analysis until we can find out exactly who is giving this gift to the senator. So who gives the gift? Number two, what is its value? And I'll discuss the importance of that in a little bit. And then number three, what is it, just precisely? And that's really important because you're going to hear me repeat this a number of times. When it comes to travel, conferences, lodging, things like that, there's heightened reporting requirements. So that's sort of the background. These are the facts we need to know. We have three legal questions you'll see on page 5. First one seems simple, but I'll explain. Is it even a gift? And it's kind of funny. The Act defines a gift in a very, very broad manner. It's any gratuity, favor, discount, entertainment, hospitality, loan, forbearance. I mean, it's anything and everything. Very, very rarely someone will try to argue that, it's not a gift because it has no value. Nonsense. It has value. The only things that do not have value are, handshakes and maybe some junk mail. The very fact that someone got it for free and then is giving it to you did not suddenly convert that into no longer a gift. Someone paid something for it along the way, unless maybe they dug it out of a dumpster or something. So always start off with the presumption, yes, what I'm being offered is a gift. Then the General Assembly says, okay, there's going to be certain situations where you can clearly accept the gift. The public has confidence it's not being given to influence you improperly, and these are going to be very, very appropriate. So sort of the exceptions to a gift are given on pages 5 through 6, and there's 17 exceptions. It's true, every now and then, from time to time, the General Assembly just keeps adding to the list because, quite frankly, they like to get free stuff too. What are the things that are not a gift? I'm not going to go through all 17 of these things. I'm just going to highlight some of the ones I think are probably going to be most relevant for everyone in this room. Number one is any offer of a ticket, coupon, or other admission unless the ticket is used. That is a horribly awkward way of phrasing what it basically amounts to. If someone gives you a gift and you don't use it, it doesn't count as a gift. Please note that is the only time this sort of I didn't use it counts. It's for tickets to events. Second thing, I am going to give you a practical tip that will really make your lives a lot easier. If someone gives you a ticket and you do not intend to go, please, yes, legally you can just throw that in the garbage can, but please make a record of it. It will make your life a lot easier. Please mail the ticket back to the person or send an email or send a letter saying, Dear Mr. Lobbyist, thank you very much for sending me a ticket to the Berlin Film Festival. However, I will not be attending. You want that record because you don't want them reporting somewhere else, I gave this ticket to the sheriff, and then someone looks at your reporting form and says, hey, the sheriff didn't report this. What's going on here? Yeah, eventually the matter will get straightened out, but it's going to be a rather awkward couple weeks for you, and that can all be prevented if you just keep a very good record for tickets, saying, thank you, but I'm not attending, I'm returning the tickets, or thank you, but I cannot attend. So that's one thing that is not a gift, a ticket, if you don't use it. Number 4, campaign contributions. Campaign contributions that are properly received and reported are not gifts. That is the only thing that the Ethics Council does in terms of election law and campaign finance is let people know that It's going to be reported on one form or the other. If something's reported on your gift report, your SOEI, it will not be on your campaign contribution sheets, and vice versa. Number 5, any gift that's related to the private profession or occupation or volunteer service of an officer or a member of immediate family. This comes up from time to time. If a gift is legitimately being given to you because of something you do in your private profession or occupation, or probably more relevant for your wife, that's not a gift, you can go. Real world example, a number of years ago, there was a state official fairly high up. His wife worked in insurance. The agency for which he worked actually did have some connection with the insurance company. The wife was the #1 salesperson for insurance for, I believe, the entire Eastern Seaboard. And the company said, good job. As we customarily do for the #1 sales rep, here is a 8-day cruise and to the Bahamas and a hotel and the platinum suite. I mean, really top notch. And the question was, can I go, and do I have to report it? And the answer actually is, yeah, you can accept this gift. It was given to your wife for her private profession or occupation, and it's very clear. There's no funny business with that. It's legitimately she got that from her private profession. And you don't even have to report it, because this is not something that was given. It meets the exception of being not a gift for purposes of that. So you can go and you don't have to report it. Lucky guy. 6 and 7. Any food or beverages that you consume while you're attending an event at which you're performing official duties. That's very, very useful. I love to go and eat as much bacon as I can in the morning when I present. So that's not a gift. I can cram as much bacon into my mouth as I want. And also, number 7, very related, any food or beverages that are received, and the attendance fees that get waived if you are a featured speaker, presenter, or lecturer. That makes sense. If an organization asks you to come, I mean, it's the very least they can do is say, okay, we're not going to make you pay to come to the very meeting that we've asked you to come present at. So that's not a gift. You can accept that, not an issue. Please note, though, this is limited to food, beverages, and the attendance fees or the conference fees. It does not include the hotel lodging or travel costs if they are paying for that. Once again, travel and lodging have heightened reporting requirements, and you may very well need to get a travel waiver, perhaps, and you will probably have to be reporting that regardless. So that is not included as part of the, it doesn't count as a gift, I don't have to report it. Number 11, very similar, any travel that's being paid for by the government of the United States, any territory, any other state, any political subdivision, if it's for official business. Once again, you can accept this. In many ways, COIA encourages people to go to conferences, to go to meetings, to build, contacts with people in other states, how to do things in North Carolina, how do they do things in Maryland. We encourage all that, but we're going to report it. We're going to let the people know that the state of Maryland paid for me to go and meet with, the sheriff's conference up there. Number 14, gifts that have a value of less than $20. I call this the real lifesaver. Basically, Virginia said any gift that is under $20, it's so de minimis, it does not really make sense for people to be reporting it, keeping track of it, etc. So those little de minimis things. You're at a conference and someone's handing out those little, like hats or pens, and oh, does this person work for a corporation that has a possible contract with my office? It doesn't matter. It's under $20. You can accept it. That's perfectly okay. 15 is really funny. This was actually put in at the request of the General Assembly because they love, has anyone been here during a session in January? Oh, they love going to the old city hall and scarfing down as many meatballs on toothpicks and drinking as many beers as they possibly can. So if you are ever attend, they were the ones that put this in. I was there. So if you ever attend a reception or a function where food such as hors d'oeuvres and beverages that can be conveniently consumed while standing, that is not considered a gift, you can go and enjoy to your heart's content. This was modeled after the U.S. Senate stand-up, sit-down rule. Have fun. The only thing I will point out is occasionally contractors or lobbyists will try to get clever. They'll be like, oh, we're going to have a glass of champagne and then we'll sit down and eat steaks. That does not count. It has to be the entire event was sort of a reception and everyone was just sort of eating the food that you can consume while you are standing. And then 17 is gifts from relatives. You can always accept a gift from a relative. And personal friends. You can always accept a gift from a personal friend, but please note, for purposes of COIA, a personal friend cannot be a lobbyist and it cannot be somebody that is trying to get a contract with your office. How does this play out? Because you say, well, listen, I actually do have a really close personal friend and they work as a lobbyist. They're in Richmond. They do nothing in my county. You can still accept gifts from them if they're given on the basis of personal friendship. However, you have to report those gifts. I'll explain that in a little bit. So here we have this broad definition. These are gifts. Certain things are accepted. If something is accepted, i.e. it meets one of the 17 exceptions, you can always accept it. You don't have to report it, except for travel and lodging. The second question we had was the gift cap. What's the gift cap? The general rule is, and this applies only to 3 entities, lobbyists, a lobbyist principal, that's a company or an organization that hires a lobbyist to represent them in Virginia, or someone that has or is trying to get a contract with your office. You are limited to $108 in gifts that you can receive from somebody in a calendar year from that person, that organization. 108 for you, 108 for immediate family members. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Someone wants to get a contract with your office, they're negotiating with you. Virginia sort of takes what I call a middle-of-the-road approach. Yes, sometimes socialization is important. You get to know them. Can I trust them? Are they going to be a good vendor? We met, over dinner. He picked up the tab. That may be okay, but Virginia says at a certain point, wait, it's too much. And that limit is $108. He negotiated the contract with you and he gives you a fruit basket at the end of the year. That's great, provided the fruit basket is less than $108. So that's what the gift cap is. Are there any exceptions to the gift cap? Yes, you'll see on page 7. Once again, it's that personal friend exception. If someone is giving you a gift, but it's in the nature of personal friendship, you can accept it even though it's more than $108. The example, someone's a lobbyist, they're in Richmond all the time, they don't do anything in my county. He is a lobbyist, he gave me a birthday present, it was a $150 bottle of wine, a really nice bottle of wine. You can accept it, you're gonna have to report. My friend who's a lobbyist gave me a $150 bottle of wine. There's a little test you can see on page 7. How do we know something is given in the nature of a personal friendship? It's pretty obvious. The circumstances under which the gift was offered, the history of your relationship, and then the last 2. Was this donor, was he paying for the gift personally, or was he being reimbursed by a client? Was he seeking a tax deduction for this? If he is, that starts to look like, okay, this wasn't really given in the nature of personal friendship. You were just schmoozing and you billed a client for this gift. And then, did you give the same or similar gifts to other persons? If you get a nice fruit basket that's $200 at the end of the year, but then you find out, like, also, every single member of the Board of Supervisors in my county got that exact same gift basket, that's starting to look like it wasn't given in the nature of personal friendship. He was doing it as part of his business expenses or schmoozing, and that's something that would not be acceptable. But assuming that it is given in the nature of personal friendship, even if it's over $108, you can accept it, not a problem. You do have the option, by the way, you can pay something down exactly to $108. Once you do that, though, you have hit your gift cap limit for the year. You cannot accept anything else from that person for the rest of the year. Please, when you do this, pay for it in the form of a check or have some kind of a paper record so it's very, very clear that, oh yeah, I got a $150 bottle of wine, but I paid it down to $108. Second sort of exception are widely attended events. A widely attended event is an event that has at least 25 persons that are invited to attend or are expected to attend, and this is where it gets limited. This event has to be open to individuals who are all members of a public, civic, charitable, or professional organization, like the Red Cross Ball up in DC. They're all from a particular industry or profession, the annual meeting of the Virginia Association of Plumbers, or they all represent persons interested in a particular issue. Please note that this is not simply like a big event, like a sporting event that has more than 25 people. We get questions about this from time to time. Even more dangerous, there are lobbyists who say, oh yeah, we checked with corporate, this is a widely attended event, please take these Super Bowl tickets. Please don't. If you have any question about whether something is a widely attended event or not, please check with us. We will analyze it and we will let you know. Because if you don't check with us and you go, cool, I'm going to the Super Bowl, and then you're going to find out, oh, that's not a widely attended event. Oh, I'm well over my $108 limit. Oops, I have to pay back the difference or I'm in violation of the law. Oof, I have to write a check for $3,000. Awful. Check with us before you go to the widely attended event and we'll let you know whether it qualifies. And then the last thing is travel that's approved by the council via a travel waiver. Travel waiver is simply something where, once again, a lobbyist principal, or someone who's trying to get a contract or has a contract with your office is going to pay for you to go on a trip, official business. And a lot of times it's legitimate, like, oh, I'm thinking about using you as my vendor, but I want to learn a little bit more about this product. Well, we make it in Illinois. Why don't we fly you out there? You can make sure this is actually a very good product. Whether it's a bulletproof vest or gun or something you use for the office, that's very legitimate, but you're going to have to report it. Remember, we're reporting all the travel that we do that's being paid for by anyone that's not a Virginia state or local agency. And the problem is he's trying to get a contract with my office that's well over $108. I mean, these days, even Greyhound bus ticket to DC and, the Motel 6 is going to be more than $108. That's why we have a travel waiver. You apply for a travel waiver with the council. It's on our website. You put in the request for us. We'll make sure that it looks legitimate business as opposed to just, oh, we're going to Las Vegas to see a show or something. And when it's approved, then you can go, even though the trip was more than $108, but you're going to be reporting that on your next statement of economic interest. People ask, what happens if I get a gift I don't want? There's nothing that says you have to accept a gift you do not want. I mean, it's a gift, not an obligation. So you can always politely say, listen, that's very kind of you, but I don't accept gifts, or I don't particularly want this one, and you can return it back. Once again, keep a record of this. It's going to protect you. But that way you do not have to keep track of everything that you receive. Once again, we get to the reporting of gifts. And it's those same three entities: lobbyist principal, someone that has or is trying to get a contract with your office. Remember, if they give you anything under $20, we don't care about it. At the instant they give you something that is $20 or more, you now have to start sort of keeping an itemized list for yourself at your office. Okay, Mr. Contractor just bought me lunch. It was $22. You're going to have to start keeping track of that. Once you get to $50, that's the second sort of threshold. We get to $50, I have to report every gift that I received from this person over the course of the year. So you have sort of two ways you can go through life, which is I just really don't accept a lot of gifts except maybe from personal friends or family, or I'll accept gifts, but I have to then keep records. I have to keep very detailed notes, because once it's $20, it goes into my ledger. Once I hit $50, I have to report everything. And I'm working my way up to $108. Once I hit $108, I can't accept anything else from you. That's very kind of you, but I'm beyond my threshold unless it's one of those three exceptions. The exceptions, of course, are the widely attended events, official travel that got approved by the council, or he came from the personal friend. In all three of those instances, though, I'm still reporting it. I went over $108, but I'm reporting it on my SOEI. I report everything I get over 50 that comes from lobbyists, lobbyist principals, the contractors. So, getting ready to wrap up, we're talking about reporting gifts. Where exactly do we report them? I think everyone is familiar. You do it on your statement of economic interests. You filed a statement of economic interest on the first day you take office, as we call that the first day in office filing, and then thereafter you are filing it annually in the month of January, reporting for gifts and trips the previous year. The deadline is technically February 1. If February 1 falls on a weekend or a holiday, it would be moved to the next business day. Please, folks, do not wait till the last minute. Do not have the word February in your brain. Think January, January, January. Everyone in this room who is a constitutional officer is required to file not on paper, but using the online system that the council has. And if you wait till February 1, 9:30 at night, and sit down to start to work on this, and suddenly your Comcast or your Cox goes out, you're in trouble. You are not going to make the deadline, and that is a very strict deadline. There's no way that can be fudged. It is a computer record. Everyone will know that you didn't file it till 1:30 a.m. on February 2. If you miss the deadline, you are subject to a $250 penalty. What's even worse is it's a public record. Everyone can look and say, the sheriff couldn't even follow the law. He couldn't file it on time. So do not wait till the last minute. Please do it earlier in the month of January. Don't wait till the last day. You'll see on page 8, you are permitted to request a deadline extension. Deadline extensions will be granted by the council for legitimate things. You can see they're set out in the code, and they're serious things. The death of a relative, the governor declared a state of emergency, and because of that, you personally could not complete your form on time. You're a member of the Uniformed Armed Services. Failure of the electronic filing system, please note that's our filing system, not your cable or your internet went on the fritz. And then good cause. I think word has slowly leaked out that good cause is serious matters. It's absolutely atrocious. It's embarrassing. I don't think any sheriff ever did this, but we used to get the most pathetic excuses like, oh, my secretary was supposed to do it and she forgot, or I forgot, or I was too busy, or I was on vacation, or, the dog ate my homework, the dog ate my form. Those will all be denied. However, if you have a legitimate thing, I was in the hospital, my spouse was in the hospital, things like that, glad to give you the extension for however long you need, but it's legitimate reasons, folks, not like I was too busy or I just didn't want to do it. You'll see on top of page 9, travel waivers. I don't need to review it. I've already explained what the purpose is. Someone that has a contract with your office or is a lobbyist is paying for you to go on a trip, official business. Obviously, the trip will be more than 108. You get the travel waiver, and then you can go on the trip. But altogether now, we reported on our SOEI. Very occasionally, someone say, can we get a travel waiver after the fact? Technically, you can, but you were living on the edge. Once again, it's sort of like the whole thing about, I went to this event thinking it was a widely attended event, and then I found out it wasn't. Oh dear, you're going to have to repay all that money. So you can ask for a travel waiver after the fact. Oops, I forgot. Or oops, I didn't know this person was actually a contractor. Oops, I didn't know that this person, works as a lobbyist. So you can do it after the fact for a perfect paper record, but please, always try to do it on before. It's going to be a lot safer for you. Every travel waiver request we get, we'll process it within 5 days. If we need additional information, we get more time from 5 days when you respond. We've never missed the 5-day deadline. Technically, if we do miss it, it's a free pass. You can just go on the trip. Like I said, we've never missed the 5 days. I don't think we ever will. And like I said, they're always routinely granted for legitimate, business-related things, professional education, development, meet with colleagues, things like that. Only a handful of times have people basically said, like, I'm going to go on a hunting trip or something. It was like, how is this just not a fun trip? So as we are wrapping up, we have on the bottom of page 9 miscellaneous questions that we go through because we used to get them. People ask, under what circumstances are my SOEI filings that I do that have, my securities information and the gifts and all that, when's that available to the public? It's available to the public all the time. I mean, by statute, it's on a publicly accessible, electronic database. That's the whole point, is public disclosure and transparency. That's exactly why on the form, it's only the stuff that's required to be given as a result of the COIA Act. It doesn't have anything like, social security number, bank information, your brokerage account, nothing like that. It's just stuff that's kind of needed for the public to have transparency in terms of gifts you received and what personal interests do you have in companies or lobbyists that may be interacting with your office. Is there any way to know if someone looks at our disclosure form? No, not even we know that. It's publicly available, and anyone can look at it any time. We don't even have any way of knowing who's looking at it. Once again, that's the point. It's a public form. What information gets redacted? We will redact your phone number. We will redact any residential information. We redact the signature, although that's really not as relevant with electronic documents. The very first page, it asks for the address of your office. I can't imagine anyone in law enforcement would put their residence as their official office for purposes of filing it. In fact, I would say that's probably a very bad idea, but that's the one thing we would not redact. If you want to announce to the public that your office is 123 Sycamore Lane and you live there, you chose to let people know that's your office. So please don't do that and list the actual physical residence or the physical address of your sheriff's office. Minor children, if you have minor children, you are allowed to list them as minor child A, minor child B. You do not have to provide their names. If you choose to do so, then we will not redact that. We'll just assume you had no problems with people knowing that your children's names are, Tom, Susie, and Jeff. Most people, when I inform them about this, they do choose the option of, I'm just going to list minor child A, minor child B, minor child C. So that's our redaction. And the last thing is training. Under COIA, you are required to have training within 2 months of assuming your office, and then thereafter, you're required to have a COIA training once every 2 years. I know this has been rather brutal first thing in the morning, but folks, thank you for hanging in there with me. Congratulations, you are now all good for 2 years. Yep. And one last matter of housekeeping, you're not required to do this, but it is the clerk of your locality that keeps track of your training records. It helps your clerk out if today or tomorrow you let your clerk know, oh, I did my mandatory training, I'm good for 2 years, and I took it on this date. So, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Okay, thank you again, Mr. Poteau, for that valuable information there. We greatly appreciate you, sir. Our next speaker will be talking about active shooter training, and it will be presented by Mr. Adam King, who currently works as the Active Attack Program Coordinator in the Division of Public Safety in the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety for DCJS. So, Mr. King, is he here? Good morning. Good morning. How you doing this morning, sir?
Doing well. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, sir.
Well, good morning. Thank everyone for taking time to show up. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Department of Criminal Justice Services, and specifically on behalf of our agency director, Jackson Miller. We thank you very much for the service that you all provide. So we're going to talk about some baseline stuff regarding active attack. And when I say that, I want you to understand from this perspective that this is not information that's anything that's new. It's not a foreign concept for most, simply because active attacks all around the Commonwealth and all around the nation seem to be increasing. And as a result of that, I think the underlying factor is that all of us understand that none of us are geographically removed from that happening in our locality. As a matter of fact, it's probably much more likely now than ever that you may have to deal with some of these problems. And what we're going to discuss for the next hour together in this fireside chat is some of the best practices, some of the challenges, and then maybe some things that can help you in the future, because ultimately, from the Department of Criminal Justice Services and specifically the Active Attack Program, we want to partner with you where you are to help you do your job as effectively and as efficiently as possible, with the understanding that no one person or no one entity has all of those answers, which is why we're very excited to basically give you options of concepts and principles based upon the national best practices as a framework that then you can retrofit for your agency, for your organizational needs, for your own department policies and procedures. And what's unique about what we're going to speak about today, to include some of the case studies, and I think the elephant in the room is the Uvalde situation and what took place at Robb Elementary, and we will address some of those things. But I believe that the underlying factor is that there's different ways to accomplish the same mission. Ultimately, I would put it to you like this. I drove from Richmond today, and in doing so, when I pulled up my GPS, there was all kinds of different routes I could have taken to get here. But regardless of the traffic and everything else, there was one route that gave me the most direct path that caused me to take the least amount of turns to get to the intended outcome. And what I hope to do is give you some of those same options, with the understanding that you can take many different avenues to accomplish the same results. And what we hope to do is give you the opportunity to look at what other people have done, what's worked, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then make the best educated guess for your agency and how to get there. Quick show of hands, how many of you have had a cup of coffee this morning? Caffeination does help the motivation. I bring that up. I have to say that because I have found in my lifetime that there are two types of coffee drinkers in the room. I don't know which kind you are. I'm on the stage, so I'll talk about myself for a moment. But the first kind of coffee drinker is the kind of individual that I believe is a byproduct of shift work and working long hours, where you will take the leftover sludge that's in the coffee cup that looks like motor oil, and with no discrimination, you'll pour the hot stuff right inside of it, and you'll drink it just the way it is because you understand it still gets the job done. If that fits you, please raise your hand. No shame in the game. I'm not a coffee snob. I'm not judging you openly, but I will tell you that I have found, for me personally, I think it tastes better if you pour the old stuff out and pour the hot, fresh stuff in it. Again, that's just me. I think it tastes better. Now, regardless of which side of the aisle you sit on, which kind of coffee drinker you are, the reason why I bring it up is because whatever you brought with you in your proverbial cup of life, based upon your experiences, the things you've seen in your agency, again, my humble opinion is that all of us have something in the cup, but if we could pour that out just for the next few moments, I would like to pour something different maybe that might taste somewhat different to you. And again, personal opinion, I think it tastes better if you drink it just from the source. The great part about it is that if you don't like it, you can go back to drinking your home brew however you desire when it's all said and done. So let's jump in this thing. Take a quick look at the definition of an active shooter on the screen that is nationally recognizable from our federal partners at the FBI. And then raise your hand and let me know if anyone has any disagreements with that statement. Does anyone see anything about the actual word of shooting or the act of shooting in that definition? Which is the whole point of the matter, is that this has evolved from the catchphrase of active shooter formerly utilized to what we call active attack. Because the reality is, yes, it could happen from gun violence, but take the weapon that's used out of it. Can anything be weaponized in the hands of someone with heinous intentions? And the survey would ultimately say yes. What is the outcome of that? It is death. So ultimately, we now have to change how we have historically viewed things from the perspective that it's not so important the weapon that's used that matters as much as it is the outcome of that. So how can we do things proactively to make ourselves better, faster, stronger together as not just individual agencies siloed, but with mutual aid and mutual partnerships from those people that surround the outskirts of our borders and work better collectively together? So versus looking at it from an approach that it's just about your four and no more and just the people that have your patch and great that they have training, what do you do when you have a large, expansive response of all the neighboring jurisdictions? How good do you work together in those environments? Because those have proven to be the scenarios that envelop these active attack situations where we have a convergence of a lot of resources and manpower, and historically we haven't done as good of a job as we could in utilizing those resources effectively, of recognizing the shortfalls and then training around that before another event happens to make ourselves better. Let's take a look at a couple of the instances that have been watershed movements when it comes to active attacks and some big historic changes that have taken place as a result of that. The first happened in 1966. I won't insult your intelligence. You can read the facts on the screen. This is the Cliff Note version of that, but ultimately a prior service individual with his hunting rifle climbed to the top of the tower, barricaded the door, and then began shooting people that were down below. At this particular time, there were no special weapons and tactics program. That was patrol officers doing patrol things. And as a result of the lack of equipment that they had and the capabilities to engage from that elevated position at distance and angular disadvantages and all the things that comes with that, ultimately it was two individuals and a bookstore owner that decided to do something where they were with what they had to get some results. Specifically, the gentleman in the white shirt was deputized in a hallway just before breaching the top floor as they went in and flanked the subject and ultimately isolated, distracted, and neutralized that shooter. What we learned from that is that we do need better capabilities in our equipment, that we need some type of ability to reach out at distance for threats and open air engagement specifically. But the big thing we found is that we need some specialized training to help us more efficiently accomplish that task. Fast forward to Columbine. For over 30 years, through the special weapons and tactics or SWAT programs that probably many of you at some point in your career have been a part of and had that secret handshake and part of that club, for over 30 years that seemed to work because it had not been tested in the furnace of reality once more. And what we found on this particular day, as most of you would know, not to preach to the choir, is that we had a group of officers that by policy and procedure, everything that had worked before is they surrounded, they held a perimeter, and they waited for those specialized units. And unfortunately, while that was going on, there was active killing taking place inside. What we learned from that is that there were actually 99 IEDs on premise, so explosives were the primary method of inducing chaos. Thankfully, that didn't work. But what we found is that outside of learning about explosives and the dangers that it encompasses, is that we had to recognize that sometimes we just can't wait for a team response. If we have the opportunity for a solo response, then in some situations, that may be the best practice to reduce casualties, which ultimately is what it's about. We began talking around this time about this thing known as the priority of life scale. Priority of life scale. In other words, the pecking order, the order of importance, the driving force, the mental pecking order, the mental list we have to go through as officers on what is most important now in that situation. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. And as we began to develop this, it seemed to be this shift where we had patrolmen now got some more training. And I know that you are not removed from this, but we saw that up to this point, we had so many specialized agencies and so many specialized things within the agency, is that we lost the integrity of that baseline patrol officer and their abilities to actually perform when it comes to responding to active attacks. There wasn't a need for that. Why? Because we have people that do that. They train for that. They have toys and tricks and their magic bag that they can pull out to accomplish these tasks. And we found out that unfortunately in those situations, help cannot get there quick enough. So we began to put some ownership back in the hands of patrol until we found in Broward County at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in this particular incident that as gunfire was ringing out inside the school, this made national news because we had documented proof on this individual case, if you remember, that we had a school resource officer that was postured with body armor and a weapon and did not go in. And you be the judge of that. You can talk back to me if you like today. How was that received by the masses? Not very well. Why? Because there became an expectation of performance, of those that swore an oath to serve and protect to actually do that, to serve and protect. You would think that from 2018 that lessons would have been learned, specifically in blood, and the repercussions of not actually doing your job, not actually doing what you were signed up to do, to respond to do. And then we have Robb Elementary that took place in Uvalde, Texas. We could talk about this subject in depth a lot. What's unique about this is that more intel keeps being developed over time, and there's some really good white papers. There's a 25-page white paper from Alert out of Texas State University. There's a 70-page congressional white paper that's out that catalogs every detail that took place. And ultimately, looking at the totality of that situation, how much more different was it than what we had in Broward County? It really wasn't. As in fact, it was compounded to make the black eye even worse because we had a lot of resources that in the moment, they were utilizing what they thought was a good tactic. But unfortunately, a good tactic at the wrong time still gets people hurt. Which is why it's so important that we never remove ourselves from the mindset required to overcome this type of violence in our communities. Which is why we have to be vigilant of not just training our first responders, but also training our citizens alongside our first responders. To be immediate responders, to do what they can where they are with what they have to work with until our brave first responders can arrive. The national average is 3 to 5 minutes before a first responder shows up to an active attack situation. It's 5 to 7 minutes before medical personnel, fire and EMS, come to staging. That's best case scenario national average. It can be much faster, it can be much longer. You know where you work and live in your community. Put that in perspective, which is why it's not just enough for us to have classes and train our officers, but we also have to train our community to take that same ownership and recognize that truly what they do matters until our first responders arrive. The lesson that we learned out of that particular situation in Florida, as well as Uvalde, simply is that a solo response sometimes is necessary. And if I were to ask you how many of you have had some type of active shooter training in your career, you'd raise your hands for me because you're really great individuals, and I appreciate that. That's the time where you can raise your hand if you've had some type of active shooter in your career. Now, I would have to ask you, how long ago has it been since you've had that training? If we asked 3 or 4 of you from different rows to come together and make a room entry right now, where do you feel your level of proficiency is at? And for many, maybe they had this 4-hour block in service one time 7 years ago, and now they're a subject matter expert, and then we place these people in high-stress situations with cameras that watch them down the hallways and expect them to perform at a very high level. The reality is it's not fair, but also fair is only a human concept that exists nowhere else in nature, because life simply is not fair. And there is an expectation that you have to perform, cold and on demand. And what can we do to help bridge that gap? Of course, education is a piece of it, but most importantly, we have to create a culture of preparedness that works with both our citizen population as well as our officer population. Because there are certain things in life that we can control, and there are certain things that we cannot control. And we must focus on the things that we can control, and our level of training and abilities are one of those. Ultimately, when we look at the mindset of an attacker, we have found that this is an Avenger mindset where some broadcast, some do not. It is a violent subculture where they feed into each other through online communications. And we've done relatively well in the community of first responders by threat assessments and being able to track these things. We're doing things we've never been able to do before. But does it solve all the problems? It does not. Because unfortunately, certain individuals you just cannot profile to figure out the method to the madness or the major dysfunction that they are experiencing. The number that I would like you to face and look into, most importantly when it comes to the attacker, is the recognition, the fact that many times, 98.7% of the time in these events, it's a single attacker. And in the other odd percentage, if there is more than one, they're generally in the same location. So what if I told you today that on your drive home, that you have a 98.7% chance of winning the lottery? How many of you are going to stop at some gas station and plop your money down on the counter? Those are pretty good odds. So the reality then is that in responding to these active attacks, specifically if you're the first person on scene, there's a 98% chance that you're going to be able to get to the location of that particular individual to isolate, distract, or neutralize. Those are great odds for the survivability of others. Again, there's things we can control, there's things we cannot control. We cannot control every active attack that happens, but we can control our response to it. And by being proactive in our response, doing what we can where we are with what we have to work with, we set ourselves up for success and others that are responding up for success. So it no longer is a matter of should we respond. I think all of us agree to that. But how do we respond? And then what do we do not just during the response, but after? Because that also raises a lot of questions and a lot of headache and hardship is once we converge with all kinds of resources to a crisis site, how can we now reverse engineer that process and begin removing people that need help, that are injured, that need treatment, and get them to that highest degree of care? What is the best practice for that? Gone are the days where we can have scenarios or reality-based training where we put the shooter down and then we high-five and we say, that was a great job, let's go debrief. Because the reality is the hard part is not eliminating the threat, but it's what do you do to stop the dying after the fact? And that's where we hope that there's a shift in mindset and movement as officers as a whole to recognize that not only is it important to stop the killing, but you also must stop the dying. And to do that, we have to utilize what's known as rapid casualty evacuation. Every officer needs to have a baseline of medical understanding for their own personal treatment, as well as those around them if they need it. And if they feel morally obligated or inclined to do so, to help their citizen population medically, but ultimately getting them to the highest degree of care is what's going to increase survivability as a whole. If we look at the location of these attacks, for a long time, the general consensus was that it only happened in schools. And I would like to tell you that that was the case, and we saw a shift when that happened because we began to harden those facilities by placing school resource officers in those locations. We have now seen an uptick in trend take place where places of commerce are now the number one location for active attacks. And I'm sure you can think back and through your mind's eye and think about the situations that's now happening at supermarkets. We used to hear things like maybe movie theaters from time to time, like in Aurora, Colorado, maybe houses of worship. We've seen that happen in Texas. We saw it happen in South Carolina. We've seen it happen at airport terminals. We've seen it happen ultimately at target-rich environments where we have specifically open air style environments, even if it's in a place, it might be a large venue, where we have limited points of ingress and egress. It seems to be the perfect scenario for these attacks to be carried out. And I understand that to everyone, especially if you're in leadership, that is a very big challenge that you have in your locality, especially with reduced capacity and numbers and people to place and security measures in those environments. So understanding the environment is a piece of it, but also understanding what that looks like to respond, especially from what is now considered the best practice. The first person on scene must run towards the sound of gunfire, or what does a solo response look like to those venues? And now it's compounded even more differently to the point that no longer are we telling you to go to the breach point and wait, but we want you now to move towards the sound of gunfire to stop the killing, and then transition with the same tenacity and vigor that you moved to the sound of gunfire to stop the dying by providing medical aid, ultimately began to evac casualties as quick as possible. When we talk about solo response, I mentioned to you before the priority of life. And ultimately, this is the priority of life that was developed way back at Columbine and has now been ingrained in law enforcement. And hopefully this is a culture that is prevalent in your agency, where our priorities of life are innocent civilians, then first responders, and then suspects. If failure to act results in the death or injury of innocent civilians, you have to go. If it results in the death or injury of first responders, you have to go. But if we take those two considerations out of the fact and it's just the suspect, and that's a situation where now we're going to revert back to historically how we've handled things, but we would call that simply a barricaded suspect. Now, I would ask you to be the judge in this situation. Think about Uvalde. Was there access to innocence? Then we have to go. If that person is not actively killing, if you articulate they're no longer pulling the trigger, but there are people there that are injured and bleeding out, and not to insult your intelligence, but you can bleed out in as little as 2 to 3 minutes based on the severity of the wound and the location. So 2 to 3 minutes from point of injury to the point of expiration. And if we have people that are bleeding out, we have to go. Understanding stopping the killing is important, but equally as important is stopping the dying. And if your failure to act will result in innocent civilians or first responders' lives to be in jeopardy, we have to go. You would hope that this is something accepted by all, but what's very difficult is that only you knows truly how you're going to react. We can have training, we can have classes, we can have opportunities to build neural pathways of exposure where people can be in reality-based training, but when you find yourself in a situation, only you are truly going to know how you're going to react. Now, we can help reinforce a culture of preparedness by allowing multiple opportunities. And have anyone ever heard the phrase, "my life flashed before my eyes"? That's a psychological process that happens where your body opens up your mind like a filing cabinet to find out a situation in your history that looks similar to the one you're in currently to see what you did to survive. And if you've never placed anything in that filing cabinet, that's when people say time slowed down and time dilation takes place. And their life flashed before their eyes. What we hope that you do through your training, through your development, and if you need help, partnering with DCGS to help facilitate that, is give snapshots of reality for each individual officer to place in their filing cabinet. Not to make them a subject matter expert. It'd be great if we could do that and just do a data download. But the reality is we can't do that in the amount of time we're given without repetition over time. What we hope to do is give you the opportunity to give a snapshot in each individual's officer's mind's eye. So that if they find themselves in a situation, at least it's not foreign to them, and at least they have a point of reference on how that they can survive that encounter. Because what they do truly matters. Not just for them, but for those that they're responding to. Because if they die, they don't have to live with that, as harsh as that may sound. But unfortunately, I've been part of some teams, I've been part of some incidents, much like probably you have too, where people have died. And there's certain friends, officers, brothers in arms, sisters in arms, that chose not to do anything, and they have hard times living with that. So we hope that you do is prepare your mind, as Colonel Grossman says, for where your body may have to go. And that's a phrase he took from Officer Stacy Limbs, who was followed home by some gang affiliates that she was doing a case on in L.A. She was shot multiple times with a .45 caliber ACP round. As she laid there on the street, she talked her heart rate down and she survived. And later in the hospital, they asked, "How did you survive that?" And she said, "Because I prepared my mind for where my body may have to go." Now, this is something that we wish no one has to endure, no one has to go through. But the reality is that if we continue to do this job, we may be faced with these hard choices, which is why beginning now and going forward, I hope that you're creating a culture of preparedness in your own agency where each individual officer has to prepare their mind for where their body may have to go. When we talk about operational goals, we've said stop the killing, stop the dying, evacuate the casualties. Those are the order of importance. If we were to simplify down an active attack into the most simplistic formula, this would be it. Stop the killing, stop the dying, then evacuate the casualties as quick as possible. Quick show of hands, how many of you have some type of mutual aid in your communities with your fire and EMS to where you have a rescue task force agreement set up where they will come into a warm zone? Outstanding. I applaud that. That's fantastic. If you don't have your hand raised, I would encourage you to pursue that. But don't feel that you're outside of the circle, because for you, you're still obligated to perform. And for you, that's called the law enforcement evacuation model. We saw that happen in Las Vegas, where there just was too many casualties, too widespread for EMS to get there. So ultimately, officers began loading patients into their patrol cars and driving them to the hospital, which also raises a lot of other problems, because are you familiar with your hospital and what they're capable of handling? Because we can't just drop injured people off like a bus stop and hope for the best. If there's not resources and people and continuity of care, then all we allow them to do is just expire at another location. So it's important how we handle that, and that we have those talks, and that we understand that, yes, historically we've done pretty good at stopping the killing. And we've seen that some agencies are being proactive with medical training for their officers, and they're doing things like rescue task force to stop the dying, but now we have to address the problems of casualty evacuation. And what does that look like in your community? Which is why, definitively, I can't stand before you and say, here is the plan. I wish it was one size fits all. We hope it's one size fits most, but that's a conversation that's unique to your geographical location. You've got to have those conversations and figure that stuff out. Ultimately, when we talk about the differences between active shooter, many times there's these two terms that can be easily misconstrued. And what we saw happen in Uvalde is that situation was an active incident by nature, because there may not have been active gunfire at some point, but there was active dying, so it was active. Stop the killing, stop the dying. And the problem is that if you began treating an active situation like a hostage barricade, then the outcome is not good. When we talk about hostage barricade, the definition of that is a person who's at a position of advantage, who's believed to be armed, and refusing to submit to lawful authority. In those situations, the mind process should be, what is the priority of life? So for instance, if there's innocent civilians that's accessible, and especially if they're injured, then that is no longer just a hostage barricade, but that is a push situation where we have to move towards that to solve that problem by any means necessary. Now, if we were to take the hostages, or if we were to take the injured people, or the access to innocence out of that equation, and it's just a suspect inside of a room and there's no access to innocence, no access to first responders, then instead of pushing, that is a hold situation. And you would think that that is very simple in nature. I spent 17 years on a team that I felt like was pretty efficient in a SWAT capacity, and I saw people that I had respect for, that was very senior to me on a search warrant, pushed in a situation when they should hold. And as a result, from one room away, my teammate, Trooper Lucas Dow at the time in 2019, was shot fatally. So this technique, the mindset, the reality of it, weighs heavy on me, because I recognize if you make a wrong decision in these moments, you can use a good tactic at the wrong time and people will get hurt. Which is why we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our agency and organizations, we owe it to our community to be efficient in our craft and understand how to handle these situations. When we say hostage barricade, and we talk about truly what that looks like, we're talking about removing access to innocence, removing any injured people, because those situations are automatic go situations. We have to move, we have to fix that. We have to figure out a breaching solution, we have to solve that. In the event that you don't have access to that, this is the appropriate response, and this is what we saw took place in Uvalde. Is the first thing that they did is that they contained the situation by setting a perimeter. Hats off to them, that's great. But the reality, again, is they're treating a situation where they're holding when they should be actively pushing. The second thing you have to do is you have to control the situation. And I would even submit to you that until you control internally, you'll never be able to control externally. Until you can get your own emotions and your mind and alleviate all of the external factors and help you rationalize and make good decisions. And how you can do that is through repetition and training and exposure. Until you can control internally, you'll never control externally. And how do we control things externally? By the third principle, by good communication. Communicate to those part of your team, to the next area or circle outside of that. Communicate to the suspect that situation. Communication solves a lot of things. The next piece is that then we have to create what's called an immediate action plan. Or in other words, in the event, as we wait for more people to come, as we wait for a resolution, as we try to figure this thing out, we have to have in the back of our mind, what do we do if things deteriorate and we have to move right now in this second? How can we solve that? Immediate action plan. And one part that seems to be dropped by a lot of law enforcement agencies at the patrol level because it typically is only trained in the upper echelon of management as incident command. It's almost a cuss word at the patrol level. And if you've got people underneath you, you probably know what I'm talking about. And we have a very grassroots process for how we view that. Because the reality is that officers do incident command on every call for service. They size up the scene, they communicate what they have, they make an educated decision. If they need something, they relay that. If they've ever worked a crash scene, if they've ever worked an investigation, if they've ever worked any type of incident in their career, they've used the principles, and all we have to do is take all the scary words and flowcharts out of it and make it simplistic, and we have found that that is the best practice. Because what do officers tend to do if they don't have clear instruction? What is best to them? So if I tell you we have a crisis site, and I don't give you any more information, what is every officer responding going to do? They're going to come to the crisis site, and that complicates things. If I've taken care of the shooter, do I need more people to keep coming to me in large numbers? Maybe a handful, but at some point that's counterproductive because it's not just about stopping the killing. We have to stop the dying, and to do that, we have to evacuate casualties. So the next phase line of operation, the next process of thinking should be if you're responding and there's no longer an active threat, then your mindset is to stop the killing. And to do that, what is the best practice for you? Let's figure out an evacuation route. Let's figure out where we can get ambulances staged. Let's figure out the easiest path from inside to the crisis site so that now we can begin creating some type of movement or security cordon to bring in either our rescue task force or either some kind of pathway where we have officer cars that are cleared out with drivers that know where the hospital is that can pull up to the door side, curbside, and load in those patients and then drive them to safety. That's incident command. And then lastly, we want to call specialized units. We want to make sure that we have those tools and resources that we pay so much for, and the overtime we allot for training and all those things to keep those things proficient. But please understand, in that pecking order, where specialized units fall. Now, how many of you in your agency maybe have been guilty at putting specialized units at the top? As I can tell you, some of my former agencies have. And I understand why it was like that, but please understand we've got to change this culture because no longer can we wait for someone to come and save us or help us, but that ownership is now on that individual officer, and we have to help them prepare for that. And as you respond as an individual officer, some of the things that are very challenging, as I asked you a moment ago, how many of you have had some type of active shooter training or entry training? Most of you raised your hand at some point in your life and career. One of the cardinal rules of making room entry is that you don't let someone go in a room by themselves. Do I have any disagreement with that? It's kind of baseline, right? Because numbers are better. We want to increase our survivability. And what's hard is when we have decades of indoctrination of how to use certain tactics and principles, and now we begin addressing the fact that, well, maybe you have to do it by yourself. What does that look like? Especially when it goes against the culture of how we have asked people to do things for so long. How many of you have some type of solo officer response training in your agency? Give me a quick show of hands. Outstanding. We need more like you. We need more people that understand and recognize the fact that when you're as a solo officer, when you show up the first person on scene, you have to be led by driving force. So if there is active killing, you're not waiting, you're going. That is a push situation. If there is no active killing, then you're now researching for actionable intelligence, such as dying. What does that look like? Injured people, blood trails. When you see that, that has the same understanding and importance of active killing because people are actively dying, so we have to push on that. No longer can we wait for others, we have to go. Of course, when this takes place, effective communication is what allows us to maintain that incident command. Being NIMS compliant, one of the terms that we've utilized for many, many years in our programming is known as LCAN, L-C-A-N. It stands for Location, Conditions, Actions, Needs. I'm sure each of you are probably familiar at some point in your career of someone that got on the radio and wanted to talk and give you many more details than were needed for that situation. And if you don't know this person, then that's probably because it was you and this just became an intervention. So there you go. We're trying to help you out with your clear communication. You can smile this morning. I promise I'm coming to a close in just a moment. But something simple like this is very effective because something that often is forgotten about in that solo response is how can I take this huge problem that's too big for me to wrap my arms around myself and make it digestible? How do I eat that elephant one bite at a time? It goes by your communication because you will not get the resources you need in the way that you need them unless you communicate with that. And the most effective way of communication, the baseline from a solo response that goes all the way up to advanced, is what is your location? What are the conditions of the situation? For instance, do I have shots fired? Because if I do, guess what everyone else's response is going to continue to be? But now, would it change things if I said things like this? The shooter has been neutralized. What does that do to everyone else internally now? Where should the mind shift take place at for all the responding officers? Now I should start thinking about it because I'm part of a culture of preparedness. Instead of necessarily just running to that site, maybe now I begin to look at where the big picture of things are and reverse engineer this problem-solving piece of how can we evacuate those casualties, because that's what helps us stop the dying. What are the actions that you have taken, such as I've secured the suspect, maybe I've cleared this hallway, maybe I haven't. Maybe I entered in this doorway. This is a good place to go. I came in this doorway. Or I breached this window to get in. And what do you need? I need 4 responders to come into my location to help me finish securing this suspect and area. I need follow-on resources to begin developing an immediate action plan, to begin working towards cordons so we can get those casualties out to safety. Locations, conditions, actions, needs. A little bit of the mindset when it comes to the solo officer. Do we have any prior service individuals? Thank you very much for your service. This is a concept derived from military, where maybe you've heard it known as the combat triangle. We call it the survivability triangle, but the concept is the same. We're in this triangle to increase your survivability. There's 2 attributes that holds that up. The first is going to be your mobility. And the way that I define mobility is the ability to move. Pretty simple. Second one's going to be lethality. The way I define lethality is the ability to be lethal. So let's do a quick word problem together. What is more lethal? Myself responding solo with just my pistol and my gun belt, or maybe a team of 4 with a couple rifles? What is more lethal in that situation? In other words, 1 gun or 5 guns, what is more lethal to the bad guy? I think all of us would agree 5, but you're shy. I get it. It's early in the morning. We kind of just met like 30 minutes ago. What is more mobile? Me by myself, moving individually as I feel the need to do so, or as a team of 4 people I've never met before because I've got the locality here, I've got some kind of game warden guy that showed up, I've got the CSX gas police I didn't even know was a real thing that dropped out of the sky from somewhere, I've got people I've never seen before, and now I'm trying to work together in one of these formations that I heard about 10 years ago when I came out of the academy. And I did a little bit of training and dabbled in it for about half a day. What is going to be more mobile? So the reality is that is an ebb and flow situation, and it works out to increase survivability, because if you move slower, it's okay because you have more people to cover those angles that you have to deal with. The reality, though, from a solo perspective is that if you don't have that lethality, if you don't have that many sets of eyes to look in all the dangerous situations, then it's your speed of movement. Your speed becomes now part of your security and your lethality. So we have coffee cup slogans and T-shirts that look really tactical that say speed is security. That's the method to the madness. And that's something from a solo perspective we have to talk about. Is when we respond from a solo perspective, it's not so much the fact that you can shoot your gun like John Wick. That's awesome if you can do that. But unfortunately, a lot of places we have found that is incorrect. Look at the annual quals, or firearms monitoring as we often call that sometimes. As you can see those scores, is that under high-stress situation, they may not necessarily perform as well as they thought that they did, especially on the flat range. But understanding the technical pieces of mobility and how that plays in their survivability can help set them up for success. Because in doing that, the operation goals of an exigent response, this is not new to you, just reinforcing what we've talked about, is that solo responder is there to stop the killing, to stop the dying, evacuate the casualties, and what tells them when they get to that front door, whether they go in or whether they wait for backup, are those priorities of work, which again is the priority of life. If failure to react will result in injury or death of innocent civilians or first responders, we have to go. And if there's no access to those, then in those situations we can wait with the understanding that yes, the more people you have, the safer it can be. With the realization that you can get too big. We have found that about 4 to 5 people is about the optimal amount of people to gaggle together when clearing a structure, especially if it's an ad hoc team. I'm not talking about people just in your agency that train your way, that's familiar with your policies and procedures, but I'm talking about ad hoc people that's never met before. Somewhere around 4, no more than 5 people seem to be the best practice. If you get more than that, it just becomes this tactical blob down a hallway that's very easy to, with that little accuracy, to effectively engage. So looking and putting that into perspective, we're talking about the fact that, yes, if you can wait for help, do it, because that increases lethality. But also don't miss the point that your failure to act, if there's actionable intelligence based on the priority of life, if you're by yourself, you may still be obligated morally to move towards the sound of gunfire. Let's take a look at what this
436.
looks like.
I'm on the scene. I'm command of the high school. I've got children running out. Go, 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 go. 436. I'm inside the high school at this time. Stand by. Sir, can you hear me? 436. I've got 1 injured. Moving to check. Hey, drop that gun now!
School marshal.
Show me your ID.
It's right here. School marshal.
All right, good. Hey, holster your weapon. Pull him in. Is that room secured?
Yes, it is.
All right, get him in there.
You're going to be all right. Give me your arm. Give me your arm. Can you do that? You're going to be fine.
Get there. All right, good. Hey, start working medical on him. You got a kit? You need mine?
No, I got one.
Okay.
Anybody here with medical background, can you come here and help me, please? It's going to be all right.
Hey, I've got security. You work medical.
Okay, I got medical.
436, I'm establishing command at 808. We have a victim down at the end of the hall. Okay, I've got shots fired. Shots fired. Gotta go. Gotta go.
Okay, I got it.
Moving. Go, go, get out, get out. Be advised, I have shots fired. I have a white male down suspect. Red beard, black shirt, tan shorts. I'm at the intersection of the orchestra, band, auditorium area outside of 812. I need units to come in, link up with me. I've got multiple down, multiple down.
So obviously that was a dramatized version of a little bit of what that should look like. There was a lot of things to take away from that. And again, I don't want to insult your intelligence, but some of the high traffic things we saw is that upon the initial response, there was an active gunfire. Did you catch that? What was the driving force? What provoked that officer to move into the space? He saw active dying. So he began to move under his own accord, and through that process, he encountered someone else. It was also an officer. Target discrimination is the fancy term that we talk about, shoot or no shoot. One of the most difficult things to conceptualize is that in response, you may encounter people that are still good. And in that process, one of the most difficult things if you're responding in a plainclothes capacity is not the reality that you may die or perish from the active shooter, but it's much more likely you'll be engaged by uniformed law enforcement. Which is why when we talk about solo response, that's great. How many of you in your agency as an organization have dedicated time and space for plainclothes operations? Maybe you have detectives or people in your agency or narcotics people and they do that. But how many of you at some point are off duty? How many of your patrol guys and gals are off duty? The reality is that most people spend more time in plainclothes than they do in uniform. But we don't have a lot of training, especially from the academy level, on how to deconflict properly, how to properly identify. And the reality is that we have a lot of people that do good things in their response, but unfortunately very bad things happen to them even by good people because of the challenges when it comes to identification. When we start talking about the engagement priorities is that immediately notice that in that video, he had the plainclothes officer identify himself, and then he gave them a job to stop the killing. By design, when the sounds of gunfire happen, he transitions from that killing, stopping the killing, to moving direct to threat to stop the dying, which is one of the hard things to do is develop an internal switch. that can go off and on, where you can move fast and furious to the sound of gunfire, and then you know how to slow it down, pump the brakes, compartmentalize, and do what's important now in that situation. Some things we have to talk about, especially from a solo perspective, is what's known as the post-engagement priorities of work. Post-engagement, meaning after you've had an encounter with violence. In the military, they use a technique known as ACE report, ammo, casualty, sweep, enemy. We've adopted a piece of that. We call it ammo, casualty, sweep, equipment. A little kinder, friendlier verbiage, if you will. But the reality is the information is the same. For instance, if you have to use your weapon, then we want to make sure that it's topped off, that it's in battery, that it's functional in the event that we have something we need to address again. Then we need to check ourselves because of what can happen. And as someone that's also been shot, I can tell you don't always know that sometimes. So you have to begin to check yourself, and then there should be procedures within your own training on how to treat yourself, self-aid or buddy aid to those around you. And then we need to make sure that our equipment is secure from the standpoint, if I drop my radio back here down the hallway, I need to figure that out right now because I need to communicate with the outside world. And that's my only means. So maybe I now need to do what I can to ascertain that or send a runner to bring that to me. Or recognize that that is now a weakness of mine and I need to take over and allow communications to happen by some other party or utilize my cell phone. Those are post-engagement principles that should be ingrained and talked about. And to help us do that, to accomplish that, that's individual. Now, if we talk about it from overall the scenario perspective, we have to look at it from this standpoint. We call it SIM, is we need to provide security to the situation. And we define security as by rendering the area safe from individuals, and or what does your cop sense tell you? How do you secure a suspect? You put handcuffs on them. And the reality is that maybe there's more individuals that need handcuffed, but we're going to make sure that our handcuffs go on the perpetrator, and then we secure other people by other means. And we have to talk about from the standpoint is, how many of you have arrested someone by yourself before? Most people have done that. That's just the cost of doing business. The best practice is, if possible, is to utilize more than one person when we have just a dedicated hands person with no weapon and we have someone providing cover for them. We call that contact and cover. That's something that we teach. It's something that we advocate. But if you're by yourself, you can't do that. So now we have to ask the question, and hopefully, again, a culture of preparedness, paint the picture that maybe sometimes it's better just to hold cover on that individual from distance with your weapon system. Maybe you do go and put handcuffs on them, but that's something we have to talk about. Unfortunately, something that's not prevalent is the fact that bullets are like medicine, and sometimes they take time to work. And just because you have engaged someone doesn't mean that there's still not fight in them. For those that I asked to have arrested someone by yourself and you raised your hand, I'd like you now to revisit how many of you have ever been in a fight before. And typically, when does that fight happen? Whenever we go put hands on to effect that arrest, which is why, again, if there's any fight left in an individual, it's more probable than ever it's going to happen right there in that moment, which are talking points, things that we have to paint clearly for people to understand, and then give them the opportunity and training to address those issues to figure out how they're going to respond. Then we transition now to our immediate action plan, or what does that look like? Utilizing that location, conditions, actions, needs model, a developing incident command. And then lastly is the understanding that medical is something that we all need to understand and be vivid with. When I first became a cop, ABCs wasn't airway, breathing, and circulation. It was ambulance before cop. Maybe you had the same mindset where you just drove real slow, let the bus get there so they fix that stuff. Unfortunately, it's a joke. You can laugh. The reality, though, is that's not acceptable under today's standards. Is there's an exception or an expectation when law enforcement shows up that they can do anything and everything, that they're a master of all. Which means if it comes to tourniquet application, they can do it. They recognize preventable causes of death. We have training that can help reinforce that if you don't have something existing in your agency. But there's an expectation now that medical should be performed. I'll take you back to the Hollywood shootout, North Hollywood in the early 90s, and the situation where after engaging the suspect wearing body armor for a long time and putting him down, he ultimately expired because there was a lack of medicine that was provided to him. There was no medical aid rendered. And as a result, there was a lot of litigation that took place, and there was some civil cases, and there was a lot of money that was paid out. And the reality, again, is that even if it's a suspect, there is an expectation that then you will be able to compartmentalize your own emotions and how you feel about it and still provide life-saving intervention. And we provide that life-saving intervention based on the priorities of life. So who gets care first? Our innocent civilians. then our first responders, and then our suspects, with the expectations that they're still going to get some type of medical intervention. Take a look at this image when we talk about plainclothes and solo response. I alluded to the fact earlier that if you're responding in plainclothes or by yourself, or this just happened as you're on your grocery run, think about Uvalde in that situation. What did the individual, how was he dressed when he actually made entry into the room? He was in plainclothes. And in that situation, in the video we showed you just how easy it would be, utilizing maybe some techniques we were taught in the academy, like look at the hands first. And why do we look at the hands? Resounding, it's usually the same. Because they kill you. Anyone heard something different than that? Well, the reality is that if we just look at the hands, could we miss other things? Like indicators, like the embroidery you have on your nice polo shirt you're wearing today. Or maybe the Chick-fil-A or the Chipotle coupon you wear on your belt. That's also called a badge. I didn't know if you knew what that was. Just testing you on that front. And the reality is that if we always train to look at the hands, there might be other things that we can miss. So here's a parlor trick. If I ask you right now to tell me where my hands are, you could probably figure that out. And what do cop sense tell you to do? If you only see one, the other one can only be so far away, so what is your response? Show me your hands, and it works out. The reality of that is that the mindset has to shift for the preparation of plainclothes response, that don't just default back to looking at the hands, but we want to look at the whole person, the totality of it. There's been a lot of data from Force Science and a lot of other think tanks and action versus reaction, what that looks like from both trained and untrained professionals. And what we have found through those studies is the fact that by looking at the whole person, it's much less likely that you will have a blue-on-blue encounter and engage someone that is on your side, even if they're not wearing the appropriate uniform of the day. Here's some examples of how you can mitigate that, because most people wear their badge in one of two places. On their belt down here, so if I'm at full presentation with my weapon system and you look at hands, you miss it completely. Or where's the second place people often wear that? Around their neck. And generally speaking, where does that sit? About right here, upper thoracic area. And what happens when I'm at presentation with my weapon system? I obscure that. So now I have taken my only lifeline of identification and I've hidden it with a gun. So can we see the implications and problems that develops? So here's some best practices that we've seen in visual format, either draping it down below, so at least that there's some delineation between where it is on your body that it picks up on it. Obviously, you can see it from the front, you can see it from the side. Actually, what was proven to be the best method was known as a halo method, where after you engage or in your movement, if you take your badge like this remote and you halo it over your head, that attracts movement, and as a result, people pick up on that more often. You can say it's a parlor trick. You don't have to like it. Again, I'm not here to tell you the black and white what to do. I'm here to provide some options, and then again, we want that framework for you to make the best decision for your agency. We do have training specific for this because, again, it's important. Why is it important? Because we want to make sure that you can physically, visually, and verbally identify yourself, because unfortunately there's situations like Corporal Colson, who, as his precinct in Maryland was being attacked by an active shooter from the outside, he responded from the gym in plain clothes, began to move towards the sound of gunfire and put down the shooter. What he didn't know is that on the back side of his precinct, uniformed officers who could not exit in the front went out the back and began to move around the building in an L-shaped ambush, and guess who they saw first? They heard gunfire, and that gunfire was actually Corporal Colson, because he's the guy that shot the bad guy. And as a result, Corporal Colson in his PT gear was killed, because that happens. A couple more examples we could give you, like Detective Ridley, who was responding, and he was simply off duty, and he saw two transient individuals, two homeless people fighting. He thought he was going to intervene, and through the process, through the scuffle, his inside the waistband that wasn't that great of a holster fell out, and his gun was brandished. And as it was brandished, someone nearby yelled, "He's got a gun." Law enforcement in the area who was around the corner responded in this urban environment. They hear he's got a gun, and they see just about the time Detective Ridley is reaching down to pick it up to secure it back in his waistband. And guess what happened? Gun in hand is a gun in use. And they shot him. Is it fair? No. But again, fair is only a human concept because life isn't fair. Corporal Jenkins was at a football game, and was attempting to approach some underage individuals who were drinking. Right, wrong, or indifferent, at some point he brandished his firearm to let them know who he was. That was his method of identification in his plainclothes capacity. Right, wrong, indifferent, you can tell me how you feel about it later. It really is not how you feel that's important, other than the fact that they all began yelling, "He's got a gun," at a sporting event. And what do you think the plainclothes response was in that situation? Now, these are not even incidences where people are responding knowing that there's active killing. These are people just responding to a weapons call. How many times have you done that? How many times have your officers on patrol done that? Now, compound that interest of stress by placing them in a situation where they know people are actively being shot. And now, where is their startle response going to be? Their volume is probably going to be turned up to 10, which is why we have to do everything we can in our training beforehand for those plainclothes individuals and also for those uniformed individuals with an understanding that they may come across people in their path trying to do good things. I'm going to fly through the next part so we can make sure we end on time. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that from 2019 to 2021, there were 16 incidents where a solo officer responded and stopped an active threat. And of those 16 times, 13 times that solo officer was the solution, and those 13 officers, 20% of the time were injured. I don't think any of us want to send people that we care about into harm's way. 20% of the time, those people were injured, which is why we have to paint the clear picture that bad things can happen to good people. You can't save everyone. You do what you can where you are with what you have to work with. But be prepared. Prepare your mind for where your body may have to go, because you may have to do more than you were willing to do, than you prepared to do. And the only way we can truly be ready for that is to make sure we have things in place that paint the clear picture that help us create a culture of preparedness. So how do we win this whole situation? Win, for us, acronym we utilize, what's important now. That's how you win the situation. You take something big and you figure out what's important now in this situation, and you do that. And then you do the next right thing and the next right thing. So from a solo perspective, what's important now? Stop the killing. If there's no killing, we're going to stop the dying. And we want to make sure we rapid casualty evac. What's important now? I told you at the beginning of this fireside chat that there's certain things that are controllable, there's things that are not controllable. If I were to ask you now to review these controllable factors, I would love your candid opinion on whether you agree or disagree. One thing we can control before responding to violence is the equipment that we bring to the fight of that day. Do you have the correct equipment? Does your agency provide that to your officers? But more importantly, are your officers proficient in its use? I can't help but think about the 28-year veteran who was trying to extract a wanted individual from the B-pillar of his car. And as she pulled out her Glock and yelled, "Taser, taser, taser," and she shot him point blank, that now she's behind bars. Because for 28 years, she had carried a taser at some point in those 28 years, not all 28 years, because the technology wasn't there. But for as long as tasers had been in her department, for years she had carried it, but she had never drawn and fired it. And in stress, she did the only thing that she had been trained to do, or that she had prepared to do. So it's not just a matter of, do we have the right equipment? Can it be employed correctly? Because those are things we can control. Our skill at arms are tactics. We could talk about it all day. I've given you a small, brief 30,000-foot view into some of the best practices and tactics. Uvalde, they did active shooter training in December before this event occurred. In-house active shooter training. So you would think that just a couple months later that'd be somewhat fresh in their mind, but it wasn't. And I would have to ask you, how often do you do it in your organization, agency? I think most of us would agree it doesn't happen often enough because so many other things have priority and vouch for our time. There's only so many hours in the day. But this is something that we can control before we find ourselves in an act of violence. Obviously, the physical fitness of our officers are truly important. Strong people are harder to kill. And remember, it's not just enough for you to survive, because if you don't have to live with that. But it's, do you have enough gas in your tank to save those around you? Because if you don't, that might be more difficult to live with, knowing that you could not perform in those environments because you didn't prepare prior. And the last is going to be the mindset, which truly is the whole point of this talk today. Is I hope that it's a shift of a mindset, that it opens up your eyes, that it's not anything that's new information, but it's some information we all have to digest and process now more quickly than ever. Is the mindset of the patrol officer and their response has to change, as well as the mindset of our supervision to recognize how can we handle these things that are all-encompassing. I'd ask you to think of an event as we come to a close. And when I say think of an event, I don't want you to name the person because it's not about that. But I want you to think of an event, and I want you to think about what was used as a weapon. Maybe it was the Mandalay Bay Hotel where the guy shot 1,000 rounds in 15 minutes. Or it could be the Charger that was driven down the streets of Charlottesville during civil unrest. Maybe the Boston Marathon bombing with a pressure cooker off of a Target shelf. Maybe it was a church situation in South Carolina where a gentleman walked in, held hands with 13 people, and after an hour of prayer executed them all point blank. We could talk about schools, Sandy Hook, Columbine. We could keep going, LAX Terminal. We can keep going on. Congressman Steve Scalise. How about the courthouse shootings right here not too far away from this place? Of those, I mentioned when and where they happened. And if we think about who, and I asked you to put that into perspective, did they all look like the same people? Do they all have the same belief system? Could we profile them and say if it's this one type of individual? The fact of the matter is it could look like anybody and everybody in this room. And if we said that if we take all the guns away, will that fix it? Not necessarily, because then we have vehicle-borne attacks and we have ID attacks. If we take vehicles off the road and say you have to use public transportation, we no longer sell pressure cookers, does that solve the problem? I would love to say yes, but the reality is anything can be weaponized in the minds of those with heinous intentions. If we knew with certainty where it was going to happen, we would put up some type of safety checkpoint or send more officers to mitigate that. But we don't know. Those are things we cannot control. We can't control who. We don't know what they're going to use. We don't understand when and where it's going to happen. And I think all of us ultimately just ask this question is, why does it happen? And I would love to provide you that answer. I don't have that answer, but what I do have for you is that is why each of us must train our people, our organization, to be proficient in their craft. To help us do this, the last triangle that I will give you today is the preparedness triangle, which is awareness and willingness. And what I mean by that is awareness of what you're good at, your strengths, and also your weaknesses. And then willingness to do something with the areas that you're weak in and train, and most of us are pretty good at doing that. Where I have found that a lot of individuals in this profession struggle, again, I'm talking to myself, not necessarily you, is it's hard to take something you do well and hand that to somebody else because that significance is in that difference to you. The days of an FTO showing up and letting a person fail underneath their command because that's how I learned, we can't afford to do that anymore. I want to take people and let them start out where I ended in my career so that they can start from that point to go beyond where I'm at. And until we have that mindset, we're never going to be prepared because preparedness is about awareness and it's about willingness. And what are you willing to do when it's all said and done? We said we can't control who, what, when, where. We don't understand why. The last thing we can control is how we choose to respond to it. How do we respond to it? Very simple. TWDH. Thoughts, words, deeds, and habits. It is proven that what you think about, you talk about, what you talk about, you do, and what you do through repetition forms who you are. Another way to say it is what consumes thoughts can also control outcome. How many of you maybe have heard it marketed this way, the what if game? When you were new to this profession and this job, you played the what if game. If that happens, then I will do this. Or what if this takes place, then I will do that. And what happens to that game internally over time with experience? For me, I played it a lot less and a lot less and a lot less because complacency set in because I've gone to that call before, I've answered that call for service, I've been to that place before. And the reality is that we remove ourselves from a culture of preparedness because what you think about, you'll talk about. And I hope this talk today makes you think. And I hope it makes you want to talk to your people. And then I hope that that talk forms some action and that you begin to do something with that. And even if it's small in its infancy, that it creates a habitual culture of preparedness. Because it would be great to say that we want to have great habits, but habits don't develop overnight. But they do begin with a thought, which is why I'm very grateful to have this opportunity today to share this talk with you and how that DCJS can help partner with you. Closing remarks is ultimately our vision with DCJS and the Active Attack Program is that we want to take the national model, national response, national best practices, and then train our citizens alongside our first responders to help bridge the gap, to do what they can until first responders arrive, and then ultimately help empower mitigation and resiliency. And to help you do your job, to help you do that because you have so much on your table as it is, most officers get some kind of training in their basic school, but most officers that have been outside of basic school for several years don't get the best practices because there's just not enough hours in the day or in-service cycles or opportunity. Which is why at DCJS we would love to partner with you and come alongside of you to help train those areas that maybe you don't have the abilities to train, or partner with your existing efforts to help further that reach to your officers with exterior response focused classes, interior-based classes, medical classes we call first responder medical instructor training. We also have an active attack integrated response where we take law enforcement, fire, EMS, and dispatchers and put them all in the same room and utilize some of the rescue task force principles that many of the hands raised that said you're part of. That's a class that we feel is very important. We also have a solo response class as well as a low light specialty class on how to do some basic patrol things, but also how light can be utilized effectively in a weapon style format to help increase the advantage, especially from a solo capacity. We also have a special school-based law enforcement class that's new, that's never been offered before, that's geared for the school resource officer and their continuity of training and how that their expectations from a solo officer is very prevalent in that field, and how we can look at, again, the industry best practices, not to tell you how to train, not to tell you what you should train, but give you the national options of what has been proven to work the best, and take that framework that we provide in a curriculum and then allow you as an agency to retrofit that around your own department policies and procedures to make you most efficient in what you do. In the end, ultimately, we've got some civilian classes. You've probably heard of CRAZE. We now have a civilian response and casualty care class that utilizes half medical, half mindset of avoid, deny, defend. That's been very popular. And lastly, as we bring this thing to a close, we have a degree of online services as well for that, where we can take this civilian response class for our community because they may not have the abilities to attend in person, and we can provide them this outlet virtually, as well as through some interactive learning modules that's also converted in several different languages as well. That is end-user driven, that they can take when they want to, whether it's a church organization or a daycare or whatever it may be, private organization in your community, that they can utilize these resources that takes the national best practices for civilians, and then takes the national best practices for law enforcement and meets in the middle. And if we don't have a dot by your county up there, we would love to come and train with you. Again, the whole purpose is not to train at you, but to train with you because we consider ourselves one from among you. That's who I am, and I really thank you very much for your time. I thank you for this opportunity, and I wish each of you personal safety in all that you do. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Thank you. Absolutely. I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. King, for that valuable information presentation you just presented us. Well, I guess this concludes our Virginia Sheriff Association Fall Conference. We hope you all enjoyed and had a good time and got some valuable information to take back, and I hope you all have a nice and safe trip back to your jurisdictions. And if I can help you with anything, please do not hesitate to contact me. Y'all have safe travels, and if you're on the board of directors, there is a meeting following here just a few minutes there. So thank you all.